There are moments in life when you hold something in your hand, and you know, with absolute cold certainty, that this object will dismantle someone's entire world. For me, it was a brass safety deposit box key, worn smooth on one edge from decades of turning a lock that nobody knew existed, and the letter folded inside it. The letter was written in my sister's shaky oncology ward handwriting on a sheet of yellow legal paper that smelled faintly of antiseptic hand sanitizer. The letter said, "He will forge your signature on a partition sale. He will steal the lake house. He will tell everyone you abandoned the family. Do not sign anything." And buried deep, in a sentence that took me 3 readings to understand because my hands were shaking too hard to hold the page steady, she had left me a weapon that she'd planted months before she died. A legal dead man's switch that would eventually give me total ownership of a 200-acre Century farm. That farm is now a free summer camp for grieving children. And if my brother-in-law's blood relatives ever want to set foot on that land, they pay me $200 a head, cash in advance. That key was the beginning. This is how it all happened. My name is Lena, and before any of this, I was a medical billing specialist who worked from a beige cubicle in a suburban office park where the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that gave me headaches by noon. I didn't have a glamorous life. I had a modest 401k with $40,000 in it, a 10-year-old Honda with a dent in the rear bumper from a parking lot hit-and-run I never bothered to fix, and a sister named Sarah, who was the only family I had left after our parents died in a car crash on an icy interstate when I was 24. Sarah was the quiet architect, the one who always knew how to build something solid out of chaos, and I don't mean that metaphorically. She worked for the county land management office, drafting conservation easements and reading property titles all day, sitting in a cubicle next to a woman who kept a candy dish full of stale peppermints. She was the kind of person who could glance at a legal survey and point out an encroachment that 3 lawyers had missed, the kind of person who would circle a lot number with a red pen and say, "This meets and bounds description contains a latent ambiguity," while the rest of us were still trying to figure out which way was north. I admired her brain the way some people admire artists. She chose a career that required patience, precision, and a deep understanding of how land records work, and that choice would eventually save me. She bought a small lake house on 2 acres out in Millbrook County, a place with a sagging dock that creaked when you walked on it, and a stone fireplace that smoked a little when the wind was wrong, and a screened-in porch where we used to sit and watch the fireflies in July. She loved it fiercely. She married a man named Mark, a guy with a salesman's grin and a habit of calling himself an entrepreneur, but never quite describing what that meant beyond a series of failed ventures. A shuttered gym franchise, a nutritional supplement line that never launched, a timeshare resale business that left a trail of angry customers. I didn't trust him from the beginning, but I kept my mouth shut because Sarah loved him and because she had this capacity for seeing the best in people that I never managed to cultivate. I have to own that. I saw the red flags and I stayed quiet. I won't make that mistake again. When Sarah was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer at 41, I didn't hesitate. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while I was reconciling a stack of denied claim forms. I heard her voice crack on the word malignant, and I felt the floor of my cubicle drop away. I scheduled 2 weeks of leave, but 2 weeks became a month, and a month became a resignation when I realized I wasn't going back. I cashed out my entire 401k, all $40,000, and I moved into the lake house to be her caregiver. The process of liquidating that retirement fund was a bureaucratic nightmare of its own. Early withdrawal penalties, tax withholdings, a mandatory phone call with a Fidelity representative who asked me 3 times if I understood the long-term consequences, as if I were a teenager trying to buy a motorcycle. I said yes each time, because the long term meant nothing if Sarah wasn't in it. I learned how to track every dime in a spiral notebook with columns for copays, out-of-network specialists, and the endless stream of nutritional supplements the oncologist recommended, but insurance wouldn't cover. Ginger capsules, turmeric extract, a brand of protein shake that cost $60 a case. My medical billing background helped me fight claim denials with insurer-specific language, citing CPT codes and medical necessity justifications, spending hours on hold with utilization review nurses who didn't understand why a dying woman needed a specific anti-nausea medication that wasn't on their formulary. I became Sarah's full-time advocate, her pain scale translator, her midnight handholder when the dexamethasone made her restless, and the world felt like an open wound. The chemotherapy schedule ruled our lives. Every third Tuesday, we'd drive to the infusion center, a low building with a fountain in the waiting room that made a sound like constant rain, and she'd sit in a recliner with a heated blanket while the poison dripped into her port. I'd read to her from old mystery novels, the kind with yellowed pages and broken spines that we used to borrow from the library when we were kids. I learned to flush her PICC line with saline, to change the dressing without contaminating the site, to recognize the early signs of sepsis from the smell of the wound. I managed her feeding schedule when the chemo stole her appetite, blending soups into a consistency she could tolerate, marking her intake on a chart taped to the refrigerator. I handled her insurance appeals, her bedpans, her bad days when she couldn't recognize my face through the chemo fog. I learned how to rewire a faulty light fixture in her bedroom because the flickering would trigger migraines for her, and I used a set of old tools I'd kept from a summer job as an electrician's apprentice back when I was 19. That summer, I'd worked for a family friend's contracting company, pulling Romex through stud bays, wiring outlets, learning how to read a circuit panel, how to safely test a GFCI outlet, and how to trace voltage through a wall using a non-contact tester. I learned how a pin tumbler lock works because the company also did locksmithing for rental properties, and one of the journeymen showed me how to use a rake pick on a standard Schlage cylinder. He said, "It's just geometry, kid, pins and springs and a shear line." I never thought that skill would matter beyond a party trick, but I stored it away the way you store a spare key in a drawer you never open. That little skill, that quiet competence with current and conduit and pin tumblers, is what later let me pick a lock that should have been unbreakable. It's strange how your past prepares you for the wars you never see coming. Sarah died on a Tuesday morning in late October. The leaves on the oak outside her window had just turned the color of rust, and a single squirrel was working its way along the branch, pausing every few inches to flick its tail. I was holding her hand, and her breathing changed, slowed, and then simply stopped. I remember the way the oxygen concentrator kept humming, a steady mechanical pulse, because machines don't know when someone leaves. The room smelled of lavender oil and the faint clinical tang of medical tape. I sat there for a long time, holding her cooling fingers, watching the squirrel, and I felt a strange, hollow emptiness, and beneath it, a cold clarity. Grief hadn't made me foggy. It had made me precise. Mark was downstairs on his phone. I could hear his voice through the floor, a low murmur of some deal or another. I closed her eyes myself, with 2 fingers on each lid, the way the hospice nurse had shown me. I sat there for more than an hour before I could bring myself to go downstairs and tell him. When I did, he was leaning against the kitchen counter with a protein bar in one hand and his phone in the other, and he looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as mild inconvenience. He said, "Already. I just got off a call." Then he put down the protein bar and walked upstairs, and I stood alone in the kitchen listening to his footsteps on the hardwood, and I knew in that moment that something was deeply, irreparably wrong. Within 24 hours, the vultures circled. Mark had wasted no time. By noon on Wednesday, he'd already called a real estate attorney and had a woman named Tanya standing in the kitchen as if she owned the place. Tanya was a slim, aggressively blonde real estate agent in her early 50s who wore a tailored blazer with brass buttons and pearl earrings, and spoke in the overly polished tone of someone who believes that everything can be solved with the right legal document and the right staging furniture. Her heels were too high for a house with hardwood floors, and she kept wobbling slightly on the area rug, catching herself with a little grimace. I later learned she and Mark had been involved for at least 6 months, which explained a lot of those business trips. Together they radiated a kind of performative competence, the kind where they manage everything in order to control everything, all while pretending to be helpers. They arrived to take care of the estate and to support me in my grief, but I noticed that neither of them shed a single tear. Mark kept talking about the need to close out probate quickly, to liquidate assets, to protect me from the burden of a house I couldn't maintain on my own. He used phrases like streamline the process and maximize the market value, but he never once said Sarah's name. Tanya opened the refrigerator and started tossing out the medical supplies, the unopened cans of nutritional shakes, the little plastic containers of applesauce that Sarah used to eat when everything else tasted like metal. She did it with the efficiency of someone cleaning out a hotel minibar, and I stood in the doorway with my arms crossed, watching her, saying nothing. Grief sharpens your peripheral vision. The will was straightforward. Sarah had drawn it up 5 years earlier, before the cancer, and left the lake house, valued at the time around $390,000, to me and Mark equally, as tenants in common. No trusts, no special clauses, just a clean split. Her small investment account went to Mark, her personal belongings to me. The only surprise was a safety deposit box at a local credit union, listed on the estate inventory with no box key in the house. I asked Mark about it, and he waved a hand, saying it was probably empty, an old account she'd forgotten about, the kind of thing people open when they're young and then abandon. I made a mental note of that and said nothing. The absence of that key felt like a held breath, a missing tooth in a perfectly good smile. Mark and Tanya insisted on sorting through the clutter immediately. They wanted to stage the house for sale, they said, and the urgency in Tanya's voice was sharper than any real estate market demanded. They started with Sarah's bedroom. I stood in the doorway as Tanya rifled through the closet, tossing items into donation bags with a kind of cheerful brutality. She held up a silk scarf Sarah had worn at our parents' funeral, a scarf with a watercolor pattern of blue and green that I remembered her buying at a street market in San Antonio, and she said, "This might get $30 on consignment." She didn't know its history, and she didn't care. She shook it out like a rag, and the smell of Sarah's perfume, a subtle jasmine scent, drifted across the room and hit me in the chest. Mark was in the home office, going through file drawers, and I could hear the rhythmic thump of folders hitting a cardboard box, the occasional rip of a paper being torn from a staple. I kept my voice low and my posture small because I already knew, in my gut, that I was safer if they underestimated me. That was the first strategic decision I made, to perform fragility. I limped a little when I walked, even though my legs were fine. I let my voice tremble. I wore Sarah's old cardigan, a pale blue one with a missing button on the left sleeve, because it made me look smaller, like a woman wrapped in grief, a woman who couldn't possibly be a threat. I became the foggy, grieving sister-in-law who could barely remember her own phone number. In the bedroom closet, shoved behind a stack of winter blankets that smelled of cedar chips, I found a small wooden box. It was about the size of a shoe box, made of cedar with a simple brass latch and a faint smell of pencil shavings and old paper. The lid had a hand-carved compass rose etched into it, with tiny directional points that someone had inked with a fine-tipped pen. I recognized it instantly. Sarah had bought it at an estate sale years ago, at a crumbling Victorian house on the edge of town, where a woman had been selling her grandmother's belongings, and Sarah had haggled for it with a smile, paying $12 in cash. She'd used it to store her important little things, as she called them: a pressed corsage from our mother's wedding, a letter from our father written on onion skin paper, her first Social Security card in a little plastic sleeve. It meant nothing to anyone but her, this archive of a life that was now closed. I carried it out into the hallway, holding it close to my chest, and Mark saw me. "What's that?" he asked, barely looking up from a stack of tax returns, his pen hovering over a column of numbers. "Just some old box of Sarah's," I said. "I think it's just keepsakes." He glanced at it, then at Tanya, then back at me. His expression flickered with impatience, the look of a man who is being delayed by something trivial. "Junk. Toss it in the donation pile. We don't need any more clutter slowing us down. The stager said we need clean surfaces." I felt a cold little spike of anger travel up my spine, but I kept my face soft and compliant. I shrugged and carried the box downstairs to the donation pile in the garage, a growing heap of Sarah's life that would soon be carted off to the thrift store if I didn't intervene. Old photo albums, a set of mismatched teacups, a pair of gardening boots with mud still caked on the soles. I set the box on top of a stack of old towels, then waited until Mark and Tanya were both occupied with an argument about whether to repaint the living room, their voices carrying through the vents. I slipped the box into the trunk of my Honda, under the spare tire, nestling it into the well where the jack was supposed to go. No one saw me. For the next 2 days, I didn't open it. I needed to be sure I was alone, that no one would walk in on me, that I could process whatever I found without an audience. The box sat in my trunk like a secret heartbeat, a pulse I could feel every time I drove to the grocery store. The funeral was small, held at a non-denominational chapel that smelled of lilies and floor wax and the faint mustiness of old hymnals. The chapel had stained glass windows that cast colored light onto the pews, red and blue and gold, and I remember thinking Sarah would have hated the lilies. She was allergic, always sneezing around them. Mark gave a eulogy that focused mostly on his own grief, which is something I'll remember forever. He stood at the lectern in a too-tight suit and talked about how hard this was for him, how he was struggling to move forward, how he wanted to honor Sarah's memory by keeping things tidy. He used the word tidy 3 times, as if Sarah's life were a messy room that needed to be straightened. I sat in the back, clutching the program, a folded piece of cardstock with Sarah's name and dates, and a Bible verse she wouldn't have chosen for herself. I watched Tanya in the front row, her expression a practiced mask of sympathy that never quite reached her eyes, and I noticed that she kept checking her phone under her purse. Afterward, at the reception in the church basement, with its folding tables and trays of grocery store cookies, Mark cornered me near the punch bowl and said, in what he must have thought was a kind voice, that I should come stay with them for a while. Tanya had a guest house on her property, a converted pool cabana with a kitchenette and a separate entrance. It would be quiet, he said, and I could rest and let them handle the legal paperwork. I'd be taken care of, and I wouldn't have to worry about a thing. He even used the phrase, we're family, which was the first time I'd ever heard him say that about me. Every instinct screamed no, a physical recoil that started in my stomach, but I looked down at my hands and said, maybe that would be best. I'm having trouble thinking straight. My head just feels so foggy. His smile flickered, just for a microsecond, with relief. That's when I knew he'd planned this all along. He wanted me isolated, dependent, and physically close so he could monitor me, wear me down, and eventually push me to sign away my share of the house. I saw the whole play in that flicker, as clearly as if he'd written it on a whiteboard. The night before I moved into Tanya's guest house, I finally sat in my parked Honda in the dark, with the dome light on, and opened the cedar box. My hands were steady, but my heart was a drum against my ribs. The car was parked behind a shuttered gas station on the edge of town, a place where no one would drive by and wonder why a woman was sitting alone in the dark. Inside the box were the keepsakes I expected. A tarnished locket with a photo of our parents on their wedding day, a bundle of letters tied with a faded pink ribbon, a dried flower in wax paper that crumbled when I touched it. But the box had a false bottom. I discovered it because the faint pencil shaving smell was stronger at the seam, and the weight of the box felt slightly off, a 1/4 inch too shallow for its exterior dimensions. When I lifted the top tray out, a removable insert lined with velvet, I saw the faint outline of a second panel, flush with the sides, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. My fingers found the catch, a tiny metal pin in the right corner no bigger than a grain of rice, and I pressed it with a hairpin I'd straightened with my teeth. The false bottom slid out with a soft click, revealing a single envelope, unmarked, and a brass safety deposit key taped to the underside with a strip of yellowing medical tape. The key was cool and heavy, and it had a small number engraved on the bow, 117. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers because I suddenly knew, with absolute certainty, that my sister had left me a message from beyond the grave. The paper was yellow legal pad, and the handwriting was unmistakably Sarah's, though it had the jagged, erratic quality of someone writing under heavy medication, the letters tilting and then correcting, some words pressed so hard the pen had nearly torn through. It was dated 4 months before she died. I read it 3 times, my breath fogging the windshield, and each time the words hit me like a freight train. Lena, if you're reading this, I'm gone and I'm so sorry. Do not trust Mark. I didn't want to believe it at first, but I've seen the papers he's been filing. He's working with a real estate agent to force a partition sale of the lake house the moment I'm dead. He'll forge your name, take the money, and disappear. He's already told me that you're emotionally unstable and wouldn't be able to handle owning property. He's setting you up to be the problem. I couldn't stop him outright without causing a legal mess while I was sick, but I did one thing. 3 months ago, I recorded a restrictive covenant with the county. It says the property cannot be sold, transferred, or partitioned without the physical presence and notarized consent of both owners at closing. I filed it with a full property description and a certified copy to the title underwriter. He doesn't know about it. It's my dead man's switch. If he tries to sell without you, the title will be void. The box key opens a safety deposit box at Millbrook Credit Union, box 117. There's a letter inside that I left for you, with contact information for the attorney who filed the covenant. Use it. Save yourself. I love you. Sarah. I sat there in the dark with the key cold in my palm, and I cried for a solid 10 minutes, not just for her death, but for the sheer lonely brilliance of what she'd done. She had known, while dying, that her husband was a predator. She had spent her last functional weeks, with chemo burning through her veins and fatigue so deep she could barely hold a pen, pulling legal threads that would loop around him the instant he struck. She had used her land records expertise to build a trap that only I could spring, a covenant hidden in plain sight, a document that would sit in the county's deed books like a dormant mine. I read the letter again, memorizing every word, every loop and slant of her handwriting, and then I tucked the key onto a chain around my neck, under my blouse, where it would stay for the next year, a cool little weight against my sternum that I would touch like a talisman. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that justice isn't about revenge. It's about making sure the people who destroy without remorse never get to keep what they stole. Now, back to what happened next. I moved into Tanya's guest house 2 days later, carrying one suitcase and a cardboard box of Sarah's things. The place was pristine, all white linens and recessed lighting, the kind of environment that feels like a showroom, not a home, the air conditioner set so cold that the back of my neck prickled. The pool outside was a rectangle of chemical blue, never touched, the surface perfectly still except when the automatic cleaner crawled along the bottom like a blind creature. I unpacked my clothes into a small dresser that smelled of lavender sachet, hung Sarah's blue cardigan in the closet, and tested the deadbolt on the door 3 times just to hear the solid click. The brass key stayed on its chain against my skin. For the first week, I played my part so well it felt like method acting. I shuffled around the property in slippers. I sat by the pool in a chair that didn't fully recline. I knitted half a scarf with sloppy stitches that I'd deliberately unravel and redo every night. I watched old movies on a small television with the volume low, and whenever Mark or Tanya brought up paperwork, I'd blink slowly, tilt my head like a confused bird, and say I needed a little more time. My head was just so fuzzy. The grief was making me forgetful. I'd mention that I kept losing my train of thought, that I'd start a sentence and forget how it ended. They'd exchange glances, a quick flick of eye contact that they thought I didn't catch, and pat my hand and say, of course, take all the time you need. I was the perfect little broken bird, a woman so diminished by loss that she could barely sign her own name. But I was also a student of their routines. I noticed that Mark left every morning at 9:30 for meetings that never seemed to produce any income, and Tanya often left at 11 for open houses or brokers' tours, her heels clicking on the driveway pavers. The guest house had a small window that faced the driveway, so I could track their comings and goings by the shadow of their cars moving across the glass. I learned the sounds of their vehicles. Mark's leased black SUV with the rattle in the exhaust that sounded like a loose heat shield, Tanya's silver Lexus with the silent engine, and the soft hum of its door chime. I also learned the sound of the main house's back door, a heavy thud that carried across the pool deck, and the particular creak of the 3rd step on the staircase inside. I became a quiet anthropologist of their habits, cataloging their rhythms like I used to catalog claim codes. The manipulation phase kicked into high gear about 2 weeks into my stay. Mark sat me down at the poolside glass table with a pitcher of iced tea sweating in the sun and a stack of legal documents that must have been 30 pages thick, the corners curling slightly from the humidity. Tanya hovered nearby, ostensibly arranging a vase of white hydrangeas on the outdoor bar, but clearly listening to every word, her hands moving a little too slowly, her head tilted just enough to catch the conversation. Mark explained, in his smoothest voice, the one he probably used to sell gym memberships, that the probate process was moving along, that the court wanted to close things out, and that in order to settle the estate efficiently, I needed to sign a quitclaim deed transferring my interest in the lake house to him. He said it was just a formality, just to simplify things, that he'd then sell the house and we'd split the proceeds fairly, 60-40 in my favor because I'd been such a devoted caregiver. He even slid a check across the table for $10,000, a good faith payment, drawn on an account with a bank logo I didn't recognize. The check was crisp, the ink still faintly damp, as if he'd just printed it in his office. I could see Tanya's jaw clench slightly when I didn't immediately reach for the pen, her masseter muscle tightening under her skin. I let my eyes go unfocused, the way a person does when they are trying to read a menu without their glasses. I shook my head a little and said, "I don't know, Mark. That's a lot of words. Could we wait until I'm thinking clearer? Maybe my doctor could look at this. I have an appointment next week. I could bring it along." He drew back, all manufactured concern, his hand going to my shoulder in a gesture that was probably meant to be comforting but felt like a clamp. "Of course, take your time. We just want to help you through this. You've been through so much." That night, I heard them arguing through the thin wall of the guest house that was supposedly private but had a heating vent that connected directly to the laundry room. Tanya's voice was high and tight. "She's stalling. You said she'd sign anything." Mark's voice was low and clipped. "She's not a machine. Give me a week. I'll take her to the doctor myself if I have to." Tanya said something I couldn't catch, and then there was the sound of a cabinet slamming. They had no idea that I was already building a fortress around them, brick by legal brick, listening through the vent with a glass pressed against the metal. A few days later, Mark tried a different approach. He brought over a woman he introduced as a financial advisor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who claimed to specialize in helping widows and grieving family members navigate complicated estates. The advisor had a flowchart printed on glossy paper, with arrows leading to boxes that said asset protection and tax efficiency. He explained that if I didn't sign a transfer of my interest, the whole estate could be tied up in court for years, and the legal fees would eat up everything we owned. He used words like depletion and encumbrance with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd given this speech 100 times. I nodded along, my hands folded in my lap, and when he finished his presentation, I said, "That sounds very complicated. Could you write it down for me? I'm a visual learner, and I'd like to review it when my head isn't so scrambled." He looked at Mark, a flicker of frustration, and Mark gave a tight smile and said, "Of course, we'll get you a summary." The summary never arrived because they didn't want anything in writing that I could later show to a lawyer. I began keeping a forensic log, not a diary of feelings, but a precise chronological record. I used a small spiral notebook with numbered pages, the kind that looks like a grocery list, and I wrote in pencil so I could correct without suspicion. I logged every phone call snippet I overheard from the pool deck or through the ventilation grate. Mark had a habit of pacing in the laundry room when he took stressful calls, his footsteps a regular thump-thump-thump on the tile, and the acoustics carried his side of the conversation clearly up through the vent. I heard him say things like, "Drew, the underwriting delay is on your end, not mine. I need that commitment letter by Friday, and I can't close until the probate's cleared, you know that. The judge won't sign off if there's a cloud on the title." I noted down names, dates, times, and any financial terms I didn't recognize so I could look them up later at the public library. I logged every piece of mail that arrived at the main house's mailbox, which I could see from my window. Thick envelopes from law firms with return addresses in the city, glossy catalogs from Neiman Marcus and Saks, and eventually a statement from Midwestern Title Group that Tanya snatched from the mailbox and carried inside with a nervous glance over her shoulder, her fingers gripping the envelope so hard the paper wrinkled. Within the first month, I documented a pattern of extravagant spending that far outpaced any visible income. A brand new Suburban appeared in the driveway, a deep metallic gray with dealer plates still in the window. Then a diamond tennis bracelet appeared on Tanya's wrist, a string of stones that caught the light every time she gestured, which she claimed was a birthday gift from a grateful client. Then a travel agent's confirmation folder for a December trip to Aruba, first class, left open on the kitchen counter next to a coffee cup, the words Oceanfront Villa printed in elegant script. I knew, from my years of medical billing, that people who are drowning in debt often spend lavishly right before the collapse because they're living on borrowed time and other people's money. I suspected they were leveraging credit against the pending sale of the lake house, which they assumed would close any day. I started reconstructing their financial picture like a forensic accountant, building a spreadsheet in my head that would eventually fill a binder with evidence. The first piece of physical evidence came from the trash. I started taking daily walks around the property, ostensibly for exercise, a middle-aged woman in sweatpants trying to stay healthy. But I'd swing by the recycling bin in the garage near the water heater and pull out anything that looked like shredded paper. They used a cheap crosscut shredder, the kind you can buy at an office supply store for $30, and it produced ribbons of paper about 1/4 of an inch wide. With enough patience and a roll of clear tape, you can reconstruct pages. It's a slow, meditative process, like doing a jigsaw puzzle made of malice. I'd bring the bags of shreds back to my closet, spread them out on a beach towel under a headlamp when the guest house was dark and everyone was asleep, and sort them into piles by paper color, by font style, by the orientation of the shreds. The white paper with the letterhead printed in blue was from a law firm. The pink paper was a carbon copy, probably from a checkbook. The glossy paper was from a magazine, which I discarded. I used clear packing tape on a glass-topped side table that I'd covered with a white pillowcase to provide contrast, laying the shreds out one by one and aligning the edges until words began to form. Over several nights, I pieced together fragments of a document that stopped my heart. It was a copy of a stipulation for partition and sale, filed in the Millbrook County Court under case number CV 2023-0882. The document requested a court-ordered sale of the lake house due to the inability of co-owners to agree on management, a phrase that implied I was being difficult, obstructive, uncooperative. Attached to it was a notarized consent to partition, bearing my name and what was supposed to be my signature. The signature was a looping cursive flourish with an exaggerated L and a little heart-like circle dotting the I in my last name. I have never dotted an I with a heart in my life. My actual signature is a utilitarian, angular scrawl that I developed after carpal tunnel surgery made cursive painful, a quick series of strokes that looks more like a seismograph reading than a name. This forgery was a caricature, the kind of thing someone might create if they'd seen my name on a birthday card and guessed. The signature of a woman who dots her I's with hearts, a detail that probably came from Tanya's own girlish handwriting. I felt a surge of ice in my veins, but also a grim satisfaction. I now had physical evidence of a felony, reconstructed from trash, taped together on a pillowcase in the middle of the night. But I needed the original filed document, or at least a certified copy, to prove the forgery beyond my reconstructed shreds. I also needed to get into Mark's home office, because I suspected the entire case file was there, along with whatever else he was hiding. The office was on the second floor of the main house, a room Mark kept locked with a Schlage keypad deadbolt, the kind that beeps when you enter a code and has a little red light that flashes if you get it wrong. On a normal day, that would have stopped me. But I had spent that summer as an electrical apprentice for a company that also handled locksmithing and access control for apartment complexes. I knew that many keypad locks have a mechanical override keyhole hidden behind the faceplate, a backup in case the battery dies. The Schlage keypad models have a small slot that you can access by removing the bottom screw with a Phillips head driver and popping the faceplate upward, releasing a series of plastic clips. Inside, there's a standard key cylinder, exactly like the ones I used to rekey for landlords who wanted to cycle out old tenants. With a small flathead screwdriver from my electrical toolkit and a tension wrench I'd bent from a bobby pin, I could release the faceplate in under 2 minutes if my hands stayed steady. I practiced on a similar lock at a home improvement store in the next town, standing in the hardware aisle with a display model, pretending to be a clumsy homeowner who'd locked herself out, testing my touch until the muscle memory came back. The clerk asked if I needed help, and I smiled and said I was just browsing. Then I waited for a day when both Mark and Tanya were gone for at least 2 hours, a window I'd identified from 2 weeks of tracking their schedules. That morning, a Thursday, I watched their cars roll down the driveway, counted to 60, and crossed the pool deck with my tool pouch hidden under Sarah's blue cardigan. The deck was wet from the sprinklers, and my footsteps left temporary prints that would evaporate within minutes. My hands were steady, but my pulse was a metronome in my ears. I used the screwdriver to undo the bottom screw on the keypad, catching it before it fell. Then I wedged the tension wrench into the seam and gently rocked the faceplate until the clips released with a soft snap, exposing the backup key cylinder. I didn't have the key, but I had a rake pick I'd shaped from a windshield wiper insert, a thin strip of spring steel with a series of bumps filed into it. I inserted the half-diamond pick, applied light rotational tension with the wrench, and raked the pins with a scrubbing motion. On the fourth pass, the cylinder turned with a satisfying click that I felt through the tool. I slipped inside, replaced the faceplate loosely so it looked intact from a distance, and locked the door behind me with the interior thumb turn, my heart hammering but my movements calm. Inside the office, the air smelled of stale coffee and printer toner. A large desk dominated the center of the room, covered in stacks of paper, and a filing cabinet stood against the wall with a label sticker that read, Lake House Sale. It was unlocked. Mark, for all his bluster, was lazy about the small things, assuming the locked door was enough. Inside the drawer, I found a complete copy of the petition for partition, the forged consent, and a notary certificate from a woman named Cassandra B., who supposedly witnessed my signature on a date when I was verifiably at Sarah's bedside, 200 miles away, documented in hospice logs that I still had in my possession. My name was misspelled in the notary block, with an extra E at the end, a detail that would later undo the entire certificate because a notary is supposed to verify identification. I photographed every page with a burner phone I'd bought at a drugstore with cash, taking care to capture the document's edge markings, the clerk's blue filing stamp, and the embossed notary seal that caught the light at an angle. I also found a settlement statement from Guardian Title, showing that the partition sale had been finalized, stamped with a date 87 days after Sarah's death, and that the full $390,000 had been wired to an account in Mark's name at a regional bank. The sale had already happened. Without my knowledge or presence, the proceeds converted into numbers in a database, and then spent on Suburbans and bracelets and beach villas. The forged consent was the linchpin. The proceeds were gone. I felt a cold sweat on my back, but I kept working, my hands moving with the precision of the billing specialist I used to be, flipping pages, photographing, cataloging. I gave myself 10 more minutes to look through the rest of the filing cabinet. In the back of the drawer, behind a hanging folder labeled MISC, I found a thick folder labeled Clares Creek Farm Estate. Inside were documents relating to Mark's deceased parents' property, a 200-acre working farm with a historic farmhouse that dated to the 1880s, 2 barns with rusted metal roofs, and a creek that ran along the western boundary, the same creek that gave the farm its name. It had passed to Mark and his estranged brother 5 years earlier, but Mark had bought out his brother's share for a fraction of its worth, using a predatory loan that he'd since paid off with, I suspected, borrowed money. The farm was debt-free, titled solely in Mark's name, and appraised at over $1 million, though it sat fallow, the fields going to Brome and Foxdale. I found a recent survey with a plat map, a letter from a developer offering to purchase the land for a luxury subdivision called Heritage Estates, with a letterhead featuring a clipart oak tree, and a file of zoning variance requests that Mark had been working on with an engineer. The development had stalled because the county was demanding a full environmental impact study for the creek corridor, a study that would cost $80,000 and take 6 months. Mark was desperate for the lake house sale proceeds to fund that study, so he could flip the farm for millions. The farm was his big play, the lottery ticket he'd been banking on for years, and he was gambling everything on it. I photographed the farm folder too, especially the parcel ID number and the deed book reference, filing the information away like a financial weapon in a lockbox. I didn't know then that this farm would become my camp, that I would one day walk those fields with Sarah's key around my neck, but my brain cataloged the data with a cold, quiet hunger. I carefully returned everything to its place, wiping the drawer handle with the sleeve of my cardigan in case I'd left prints, though Mark was not the kind of man who dusts for fingerprints. I locked the office door on my way out, snapped the faceplate back into position, and slipped back to the guest house. The whole operation took 43 minutes. I was shaking for the next hour, a fine tremor in my hands that I couldn't stop, but no one noticed. When Mark came home that evening, he found me knitting badly on the sofa, and he asked if I'd had a quiet day. I said, very quiet. I took a walk and watched some TV. He smiled and said he was glad I was resting, and he had no idea that I'd just mapped the architecture of his destruction. I needed a legitimate authority to verify the forgery and to help me bring the whole scheme crashing down. The safety deposit box letter had mentioned an attorney named Deborah Okonkwo. I visited the Millbrook Credit Union branch on a Tuesday morning, wearing my best lost lamb expression and a beige cardigan that made me look like a substitute teacher. I approached the teller and said, in a quavering voice, that my sister had passed away and I needed to access her safety deposit box 117. The teller, a young woman with purple-framed glasses, asked for identification and the key. I produced my driver's license and the brass key from the chain around my neck. She led me into a small private room with a metal table, the walls lined with rows of narrow drawers, and she inserted her guard key into one slot while I inserted mine into the other. The drawer slid out with a well-oiled hiss, revealing a single manila envelope and nothing else. I signed the access log with my real signature, the utilitarian scrawl, in case anyone ever needed to compare it. Inside the envelope was a certified copy of the restrictive covenant with its raised county seal, a crisp business card for Deborah Okonkwo-esque, with an address in the city, and a handwritten note from Sarah that simply said, "She's the best real estate attorney in 3 counties. Trust her. And tell her I said the plat indexing error was intentional." I read that last line 4 times because I didn't understand it yet, but I would soon. I called Deborah from a payphone outside a public library in a town 20 miles away, a phone that smelled of stale cigarettes and had a sticky keypad. When she answered, I said, "My name is Lena. My sister Sarah left me your card. She said you filed a covenant for her." There was a pause, and then Deborah said in a voice that was warm but clipped, "I've been expecting your call. Meet me at the Bluebird Diner in Collinwood on Friday at 2. Don't bring your phone." I said I'd be there, and I hung up with the feeling that I'd just activated a tripwire. Deborah Okonkwo was a woman in her late 40s, with silver-streaked braids pulled back into a low bun, and the kind of stillness that comes from decades of courtroom precision. She sat in a booth at the back of the diner, stirring a cup of black coffee with a spoon that clinked against the ceramic, and she had a leather portfolio open in front of her. I slid into the booth and told her the entire story, from the diagnosis to the cedar box to the reconstructed shreds and the forged consent. I laid out photocopies of the evidence I'd gathered, keeping the originals in my bag. She read through everything with a fine-point pen in her hand, making margin notes in a neat, tiny script. Then she looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses and said, "Sarah did exactly what I advised her to do, but I didn't know she'd actually file the covenant. Most people in her condition wouldn't have the strength to go to the county recorder's office, never mind negotiate the indexing system." She was remarkable. She understood that a restrictive covenant, properly recorded, runs with the land. It's a permanent cloud on the title. Any sale that violates it is void from the beginning, what we call void ab initio. The title company should have caught it, but Sarah intentionally described the parcel using an older plat reference that creates a mild indexing discrepancy. The covenant is still legally binding, but it's filed under a slightly different property identifier. That's why it slipped past their search. She told me she wanted it to be there for you, not for them. She used a technical error as a trapdoor. I felt a surge of awe for my sister, a woman who had weaponized the arcana of land records while dying of cancer. Deborah laid out a strategy. We needed a forensic document examiner to provide a signed opinion on the forgery, one that would hold up in court. She recommended Lucille March, a semi-retired examiner I'd once worked with on an insurance fraud case years ago when a provider forged a doctor's signature on a claim form. I still had Lucille's number in an old address book, and I called her from the library phone that afternoon. Lucille was in her late 60s, with the coiled intensity of a falcon and a home office that smelled of old books and toner and the faint chemical tang of ninhydrin, a reagent she used for ink analysis. She agreed to examine the documents if I could get her certified copies from the county courthouse, plus a range of my own signature exemplars spanning several years. So I made another trip, this time to the Millbrook County Clerk's office, a low brick building with a metal detector at the door and a linoleum floor that squeaked under my shoes. I went in person, still wearing Sarah's blue cardigan and my best lost lamb expression, and I asked to see the case file for CV 2023-0882. Because it was a public record, the clerk handed me the entire folder without question, a heavy file with a red, closed stamp on the cover. I asked her to make me a certified copy of the consent page and the notary certificate. She stamped it with a heavy brass seal, the impression pressing into the paper with a satisfying crunch, and charged me $6.50. I also pulled the recorded restrictive covenant from book 4127, page 891, a document that was exactly where Sarah said it would be, filed under a parcel ID that was off by 1 digit. On my way out, I stopped at the Register of Deeds and pulled the full chain of title for the lake house, a series of deeds going back to the original land grant, just to confirm that the covenant was properly indexed. It was, though the indexing error created a gap that no standard title search would close without a manual review of the meets and bounds description. Sarah's precision had planted the flag anyway. I brought the certified documents to Lucille's home office, a converted sunroom filled with equipment that cost more than my car. She examined the forged consent under a stereo microscope with a digital camera attachment, the image displayed on a monitor so I could see every pen stroke in 40 times magnification. Over the next 2 days, she identified 7 distinct points of divergence between the forged signature and my genuine exemplars. The slant angle of the letters was off by 14 degrees, a difference that is invisible to the naked eye but obvious under measurement. The pen pressure, measured by indentation depth under oblique light, showed hesitation marks at the base of the L and around the fake heart, little stutters in the stroke, where someone paused to think about the next movement, indicating a person who was drawing rather than writing from muscle memory. The ink type was a gel rollerball, but my exemplars from that period all used a ballpoint pen, because I'd been doing insurance forms on carbon copy paper that required the pressure of a ballpoint to transfer. Lucille also examined the notary stamp impression under a video spectral comparator, a machine that uses different wavelengths of light to detect variations in ink and impression depth. She found that the stamp was misaligned by 0.6 millimeters from the text, and the embossing pattern was slightly irregular, signs that it had been recreated using a digital image rather than an actual seal. She contacted the state notary division and discovered that the notary, Cassandra B., had no journal entry for that date. Later, under subpoena, Cassandra would admit that she'd pre-signed blank notary certificates for Tanya as a favor because they were in the same networking group. That admission would unravel the entire certificate like pulling a single thread. With Lucille's signed 20-page report in hand, I needed an ally inside the financial system. The proceeds of the fraudulent sale had been handled by Guardian Title, and the settlement agent on the HUD-1 form was a woman named Angela Cross. I called Guardian Title from a library payphone, a public phone that I could disconnect cleanly, and I asked for Angela directly. When she picked up, her voice was polished and efficient, the voice of someone who processes closing documents all day. I kept my own voice steady. "My name is Lena. I'm a co-owner of the property that was recently partitioned in a sale you handled. My signature on the consent is a forgery, and I have a forensic report from a court-qualified examiner and a recorded restrictive covenant that renders the sale void ab initio. I'm not calling to threaten a lawsuit yet. I'm calling to give you a chance to unfurl this before your errors and omissions carrier tears you apart, and your underwriter raises your premiums into the stratosphere." There was a long silence. I could hear her breathing, the kind of shallow breathing that comes right before a panic attack. Then Angela said, in the careful tone of someone who's just realized her career is on the line, "Can you send me the documentation? I need to see what you have." I said I would overnight a certified mail packet, return receipt requested, from a post office in a neighboring county, and that she should review it and call me back on the number I'd provide. I gave her the number of a prepaid burner phone I'd activated that morning, bought with cash at a gas station. I sent the packet, certified copies of the forged consent, the covenant, Lucille's signed report, a concise statement of facts with a timeline and a list of exhibits. Within 72 hours, Angela called me back, her voice now tight with fear and something that sounded like relief. She confirmed that the title company's search had missed the covenant because of the indexing error, and that the sale had been finalized with a forged consent. She also confirmed that the wire transfer to Mark's account had triggered an internal fraud alert at their bank, because the account was a new one with no transaction history. But the alert had been overridden because Guardian Title's underwriter had vouched for the validity of the documents based on the notary certificate. The title company was now facing a massive claim from their insurance carrier, and the carrier was extremely interested in a criminal referral. Angela put me in touch with a fraud investigator at the bank, a man named Simmons, who had the demeanor of a retired FBI agent and the phone voice of someone who never raises his volume because he doesn't have to. I met Simmons at a coffee shop in a strip mall 40 miles from the lake house, a place with formica tables and a single-board barista who didn't look up from her phone. Simmons was in his late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had seen too many bad people doing predictable things. He ordered black coffee and drank it without sugar while I walked him through the evidence. He had already begun tracing the disposition of the stolen funds, and he told me that Mark had used some of the money to pay off the predatory loan on the farm. But he had also racked up over $400,000 in credit card debt on top of it, spread across 7 different cards, many of them in Tanya's name. The farm was the only significant asset left, and it was vulnerable to a judgment lien if we could get a civil verdict. Simmons said he could freeze the accounts and initiate a criminal referral to the district attorney, but he needed one more thing: a clear, provable admission from Mark that he had knowingly presented the forged consent, ideally on a recording that met the state's one-party consent wiretap law. I told him I could get that confession. I'd already been planning to let Mark monologue when he thought he was winning, to hold the pen over the signature line and push him into a full, documented admission. Simmons gave me a small digital recorder disguised as a pen, a metal-bodied device with a clip and a functioning ink cartridge, and we rehearsed the key phrases I should try to elicit. "You signed this, right? You presented this consent to the court. You knew it was forged, didn't you?" The plan was set. I would let Mark think he had cornered me, and then I would trigger the trap Sarah had laid. But before the final confrontation, I needed to create one more moment to test the absolute depths of Mark's character. I had to know, beyond any doubt, that he was willing to let me die if it served his interests. I had begun carrying a small fanny pack with a blood pressure cuff and a bottle of nitroglycerin spray I'd bought online with a prepaid card, props that would look convincing to anyone who didn't look too closely. I practiced a fainting spell in front of the bathroom mirror for 3 nights. I'd go rigid, clutch my chest with my left hand, and collapse dramatically, careful to fall sideways onto my hip and shoulder in a way that wouldn't actually hurt me if I landed on the rug. I even researched the symptoms of a vasovagal syncope episode so I could describe them later if asked: feeling faint, vision narrowing, a cold sweat. I chose a Sunday afternoon when I knew both Mark and Tanya were home, watching a football game in the living room, the television volume loud enough to cover any imperfections in my performance. I walked into the room from the kitchen, paused with my hand against the doorframe, and said, "I don't feel right. I think my blood pressure." And then I let my knees buckle. I let my body hit the hardwood floor hard, the impact jarring up through my shoulder, and I lay there motionless, eyes closed, breathing very shallowly. The pen recorder in my cardigan pocket was already running, the little red light hidden by the fabric. I heard Tanya shriek, "Oh my God, Mark, she's down." I heard the scrape of a chair and the thud of footsteps crossing the room, but Mark didn't kneel down. He didn't check my pulse. He didn't ask if I was okay or call 911. Instead, I felt his shoe brush my hip, the sole of a leather loafer, as he stepped over my body, and I heard him say in a flat, unhurried voice, "Where's that folder? The one with the consent letter and the durable power of attorney form we had drawn up. If she's badly sick, we might need to get power of attorney fast, before she wakes up and decides to be difficult." His footsteps went toward the office. Tanya stood frozen near the sofa, and I could hear her breathing, a series of short, panicked gasps, but she didn't move toward me either. I lay there, counting my heartbeats, feeling the cold hardwood against my cheek, and the last thread of family loyalty I'd been holding onto snapped cleanly, like a guitar string tuned too tight. I waited about 30 seconds, long enough for the scene to be undeniable. Then I revived with a theatrical gasp, blinking rapidly, and said in a weak voice that I must have blacked out from low blood sugar, that this happened sometimes when I forgot to eat. Tanya brought me a glass of orange juice with a trembling hand, her knuckles white around the glass. Mark came back from the office with a folder in one hand and a barely concealed look of disappointment that I was conscious. his expression slipping from calculation into a forced, unnatural concern that stretched his mouth into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I watched his eyes, and I saw nothing there but the cold arithmetic of a man who had already decided I was an obstacle to be removed. That night, I locked myself in the guest house bathroom, ran the shower to mask the sound, and listened to the recording on my burner phone at least 5 times. The playback was crisp, the audio clear enough to isolate every syllable. His voice was unmistakable. If she's badly sick, we might need to get power of attorney fast. The callousness of it, the transactional speed with which he'd pivoted from my collapse to his paperwork, was breathtaking. I recorded an immediate memo on my phone, describing the event with the date, time, and a verbatim repeat of what he said, to preserve my recollection for any future deposition. That recording alone might not be admissible in every court, but it was enough for me, a permanent record of who he truly was, and it would be enough for the district attorney to understand the kind of person they were prosecuting. It was the most clarifying moment of my life, a confirmation that I was dealing with a man who had no bottom. Mark's desperation was now palpable. The bank had begun sending formal inquiries about the account activity, letters with letterhead that he left unopened on the kitchen counter, their return addresses visible through the envelope windows. The title company's legal department had sent a terse registered letter, a signature-acquired notice that the mail carrier had left on the front door because no one was home to sign, and I'd seen it lying on the entry table with urgent, stamped in red. Mark didn't know the full scope yet, but he felt the walls closing in. One morning, a Thursday, he appeared at the guest house with a forced smile that looked like it had been installed with a wrench, and he told me we needed to go to the bank to straighten out a paperwork glitch. He said it was just a formality, that my signature was required to release some escrow funds that had been held up by a technicality, and that the bank would only hold the appointment open for an hour, so we needed to leave now. I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his knuckles went white around his car keys, the faint sheen of sweat on his temples despite the air conditioning. I pretended to agree meekly and said I'd need my purse and my medical ID bracelet, which I said was in the bathroom. I took my time, running the water to cover the sound of my movements, and I sent a prearranged code word by text to Angela and Simmons on my burner phone. Bluebonnet. That meant, he's bringing me in the main branch 30 minutes, have law enforcement ready. I also slipped the pen recorder into my cardigan pocket, making sure the clip was secure, and I checked that the record button was set to one-touch activation. The drive to the bank was a study in quiet menace. Mark kept the radio off, and the only sound was the hum of the tires on the highway and the occasional click of the turn signal. He talked to fill the silence, explaining that the paperwork was very simple, just a few pages to verify the consent for the title company, and that we'd be in and out in 15 minutes, and then everything would be settled and I could go back to my quiet little life. He used the word settled 4 times, each time with a little more edge. I nodded along, my hand resting on the pen recorder in my pocket, feeling its cool metal barrel through the fabric. Tanya rode in the back seat, her perfume so thick it coated the back of my throat, a floral chemical sweetness that mixed with the new car smell of the Suburban's leather. She didn't say a word, but I could hear her fingernails tapping on her phone case, a nervous rhythm that matched my own pulse. We arrived at the Millbrook Savings and Trust, a brick building with tall arched windows and a marble floor that made every footstep echo like a church. The lobby smelled of floor polish and the faint citrus of a diffuser near the teller line. A loan officer, a man in his 40s with a receding hairline and a tie that was slightly too short, met us at the entrance and guided us past the teller line to a small private office with a mahogany desk and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. On the desk, a stack of papers had been laid out neatly, every page marked with little colored tabs indicating where I needed to initial or sign. The document on top was titled Ratification and Release of Claims Related to Partition Sale. It was a dense, 6-page document filled with legal boilerplate designed to validate the forged consent after the fact, to release Mark and the title company from any and all liability, and to certify that I had knowingly and voluntarily consented to the sale all along. All I had to do was sign on the last page, and the whole scheme would be retroactively sanitized. Mark slid a heavy silver pen across the polished wood, a pen with his initials engraved on the clip, and he said, "Just sign here, Lena. It's the last thing, and then we can all move on. You, me, Tanya, we can put this behind us and start fresh." His voice was gentle, the voice of a concerned brother-in-law, but his eyes were hard as granite, and I could see the tiny muscle in his eyelid twitching. I picked up the pen, feeling its weight in my hand, the cool metal smooth against my fingers. I held it over the signature line, the nib hovering a millimeter above the paper, and I let the moment stretch. I could feel the loan officer's gaze, could hear Tanya's sharp intake of breath from the chair beside me, could smell Mark's cologne, something woodsy and expensive that he probably bought with my sister's house money. I looked at Mark. I looked at Tanya, who was gripping her purse strapped so hard her fingers were white, her knuckles protruding like little bones. Then I set the pen down, very calmly, the metal clicking softly against the wood, and I looked Mark straight in the eye with a gaze that I didn't have to fake anymore. "You can forge my signature on a partition sale," I said, "but you can't forge a dead woman's covenant." His face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds, like a slot machine spinning through its reels. First confusion, the brow furrowing, then a dawning recognition as the word covenant hit his brain and connected to something he'd heard or half-remembered, and then utter draining fear as the color left his cheeks. He opened his mouth, and that's when Angela Cross walked into the office with a uniformed sheriff's deputy and a bank security officer whose hand rested on his holster. Angela held up a folder, her hand steady despite the tremor I could see in her neck, and said, "Mark, we need to talk about the forged notary certificate, the forged consent on file in the county court, and the restrictive covenant recorded 9 months ago that renders the entire partition sale null and void. The district attorney's office has been notified." Mark's hand flew to his chest in a gesture that was almost theatrical, the gesture of a man who's been shot in a movie. Tanya began sputtering, her voice climbing into a register I'd never heard before, insisting that she had no idea what was going on, that it was all Mark, that she was just a real estate agent who'd been dragged into this, that she'd never seen the consent, that she was a victim too. The deputy moved forward with the calm, deliberate steps of someone who's done this 1,000 times, placed a hand on Mark's shoulder, and informed him he was under arrest on suspicion of forgery, filing false instruments, and grand larceny. Mark tried to pull away, a reflexive jerk of his shoulder, but the deputy had him cuffed in 3 seconds, the metal ratcheting tight around his wrists with a sound like a stapler. I watched as they walked him out of the bank, past the startled tellers and a security guard who held the door open, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, a man who had just watched his entire future collapse. I felt no pity at all. Tanya was half hysterical, her voice cracking as she kept repeating that she was innocent, but the deputy told her to remain available for questioning and that the district attorney would be in touch. She left the bank alone, her heels clicking on the marble in a frantic staccato that echoed through the lobby long after the door swung shut. The aftermath was methodical and quietly devastating, the kind of slow-motion demolition that happens when the legal system gets its teeth into something solid. The criminal case moved faster than I expected because the evidence was so overwhelming. Mark spent 11 days in county jail before a bail bondsman got him out, and during those 11 days, I slept better than I had in months. The district attorney charged him with 5 felony counts: first-degree forgery, theft of property over $300,000, conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false instruments in a public record, and perjury for the statements he made in the probate court. The preliminary hearing was a procession of witnesses. Lucille March testified about the 7 points of divergence in the forgery, projecting the comparison slides onto a screen for the judge to see. The notary Cassandra B. flipped under pressure and gave a trembling sworn statement that Tanya had asked her to pre-sign blank certificates as a favor for a client closing. The bank fraud investigator Simmons walked the court through the financial trail, showing how the stolen proceeds had flowed into Mark's account and then out again to pay off credit cards and the Suburban. The judge bound him over for trial without a moment's hesitation. Tanya was not charged criminally, but the State Real Estate Commission opened an investigation that was swift and merciless. Her license was revoked within 6 weeks. Her name appeared in local news articles with the headline "Agent Caught in Forgery Scheme." And that pristine reputation she'd curated evaporated like alcohol on hot pavement. She moved out of the main house within a month, and I heard from a neighbor that she was now selling timeshares in another state, a fitting demotion. Mark's lawyer, a harried public defender because his assets were frozen, tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that Mark had believed the consent was genuine and had been misled by Tanya. But the recordings from my pen recorder, including the devastating moment in the living room where he stepped over my body, and the paper trail of his handwriting on the settlement instructions, were a prosecutor's dream. After a tense pretrial conference, where the judge indicated that the sentencing guidelines would be severe, Mark pleaded guilty to 2 counts, forgery and grand theft, to avoid a trial that would expose him to even more time. The district attorney agreed to drop the remaining counts in exchange for a sentence of 7 years in state prison, with no eligibility for early release until he served at least 5, and restitution ordered in the full amount of the stolen proceeds, plus interest and investigation costs. The sentencing hearing was held on a gray Tuesday, and I read a victim impact statement that I'd written on the same yellow legal pad paper Sarah had used for her letter. I said that Mark had not only stolen from me, but had desecrated my sister's memory, and that I hoped his time in prison would give him the space to reflect on what he'd done. He didn't look at me, but I saw his shoulders shake once, a single sob that might have been genuine or might have been performance. It didn't matter. The judge banged the gavel, the bailiff led him away, and I walked out of that courtroom into a parking lot where the sun was just breaking through the clouds. But the criminal case was only the beginning. I hired Deborah Okonkwo and a civil litigation partner she recommended, a woman named Priya Kapoor, who had the demeanor of a chess grandmaster and a habit of clicking her pen when she was thinking. We filed a civil suit against Mark for conversion, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, seeking both compensatory and punitive damages. The restrictive covenant rendered the partition sale void ab initio, which meant the lake house had never legally been sold. The title company was forced to unwind the transaction in a process that took 4 months of legal back and forth, and because the proceeds had already been dissipated into the wind, their insurance carrier paid out the full value of the house, $390,000, into a court-controlled trust account pending the resolution of the civil case. The court then sorted out the ownership. The lake house was returned to the estate, and as the sole remaining heir with the covenant in place, I received it free and clear, the deed recorded in my name alone. But more importantly, after a 2-day bench trial at which Lucille March testified again, and the forged documents were introduced into evidence, the court awarded me $340,000 in punitive damages, plus costs and legal fees, a civil judgment that became a lien against everything Mark owned, recorded in the county judgment docket the same afternoon the verdict was read. The problem was, Mark couldn't pay. The stolen money was gone, vaporized into suburban payments and bracelet installments and credit card minimums that had snowballed into a debt so large it topped $400,000 by the time the bankruptcy filing started. The Suburban was repossessed by the lender in the middle of the night, towed from the driveway with a quiet efficiency. The diamond bracelet was auctioned by a civil seizure firm and fetched less than 1/10 of what Tanya had bragged it cost. The Aruba Villa reservation was canceled, the deposit forfeited. The only significant asset Mark still possessed, free and clear of liens because he had paid off the loan with the stolen money, was the Century Farm. I remembered that folder in his office, the parcel ID number, the deed book reference, the survey map with the creek twisted like a silver ribbon through the middle. I told Priya, I'll accept the deed to the farm in full satisfaction of the judgment. I don't want his money, I want his land. She looked at me for a long moment, her pen frozen mid-click, and then she said very quietly, "That's a beautiful form of justice." She filed a motion with the court the next morning. We attached the recorded judgment lien and a detailed property description of Clare's Creek Farm, its 200 acres described by meets and bounds, its parcel ID, its recorded plat. Mark's attorney, a new one hired desperately by the extended family, argued that the farm was his ancestral heritage, that 4 generations of his family had worked that land, that his great-grandparents had built the farmhouse with their own hands in the 1880, and it would be cruel to strip him of his birthright. The judge, A woman with a no-nonsense bun and a voice that could cut glass was unmoved. "The farm is an asset subject to execution," she said from the bench. "The judgment is valid. The lien was perfected. You cannot shield heritage from restitution for fraud." A sheriff's sale was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon on the courthouse steps, the traditional location. Mark's extended family, a collection of cousins and aunts and uncles who had gathered at that farm for reunions since before I was born, tried to scramble together funds to buy it back at auction. But the required deposit was 10% of the appraised value, and they couldn't raise it in time. I stood on the courthouse steps in a plain gray dress, the brass key still on its chain around my neck, and when the auctioneer called for bids, I offered a credit bid equal to the full amount of my judgment plus costs. There were no other bidders. The farm transferred to me, fee simple absolute, with no debt, no encumbrances, no clouds on the title beyond a few old utility easements that didn't affect anything. The deed was recorded at the county courthouse the same day, book 4892, page 340, my name typed into the grantee line. I walked that land for the first time on a Saturday morning in early spring, with the creek running high from snowmelt and the old oaks just beginning to bud, and I felt my sister's presence in the wind that moved through the branches. I unclasped the brass key from its chain and pressed it into the soil near the farmhouse's foundation, a private little ceremony that no one witnessed but the birds. The transformation of the farm took a year of hard work, but I had the punitive damages from the civil judgment to fund it. I named a non-profit corporation after my sister, Sarah's Light, and I applied for a zoning variance to operate a children's summer camp. The environmental impact study that Mark had balked at paying for, the one that cost $80,000 and had stalled his development dreams, I funded it myself, hiring a firm of wetland biologists and ecologists who documented the creek corridor's habitat and got it designated a protected conservation area. That designation made the camp more beautiful and also meant no developer could ever pave it over. I hired a camp director who was a licensed grief counselor with 20 years of experience, and I assembled a board of child psychologists, art therapists, equine therapists, and former camp professionals who believed in the mission. We renovated the farmhouse into a main lodge with a big stone fireplace that we repaired, so it drew properly, built accessible cabins with ramps and wide doorways, cleared hiking trails along the creek, and created a horse therapy program with rescue animals from a local shelter, horses and donkeys who had their own histories of loss and recovery. We called the camp Claire's Acres because the farm had always been Claire's Creek, and my sister's middle name was Claire, a name that means bright and clear. The first summer, we hosted 18 children who had lost a parent, a sibling, or a primary caregiver, and they painted murals on the barn wall. They sat on the dock with their feet in the cold creek water. They learned to lead a horse with gentle hands, and they talked to therapists in a setting that didn't feel clinical, surrounded by the sound of wind and birdsong and the distant lowing of a neighbor's cattle. Watching them heal, watching the tightness in their shoulders loosen over the course of a week, was the only true restitution I ever needed. It was better than the money, better than the judgment, better than any revenge. And now, the piece that still sends a jolt of cold satisfaction through me every time I think about it. Mark's extended family, the aunts and uncles and cousins who had gathered at that farm for reunions for 70 years, wanted to continue their tradition. They couldn't bear the thought of giving up the land entirely, their family's ancestral ground, even if it was now owned by the sister of the woman their relative had defrauded. They reached out through an intermediary, a polite lawyer who wrote a very carefully worded letter on embossed stationery, asking if they could still use the property for their annual family reunion in late July, a tradition that dated back to the 1940s, when the farmhouse porch had been the site of potluck dinners and fiddle music. I considered saying no, letting the request sit in my inbox until it expired, because a refusal would have been satisfying in its own way. But then I remembered that the camp had a published fee schedule for private event rentals, a schedule we'd created because the nonprofit charter allowed us to rent out the facilities when camp wasn't in session, to generate additional scholarship funds for families who couldn't afford the tuition. I responded, through my attorney, that they were welcome to rent the camp's pavilion, the farmhouse dining hall, and the creek access for their reunion, at the standard nonprofit rate. I set the rate at $200 per person per day, plus a refundable cleaning deposit and a mandatory insurance rider, which is actually below market for a venue with creek frontage, horse stables, and a historic farmhouse. They agreed because the emotional pull of the land was too strong, because the alternative was a rented pavilion at a public park with no history and no ghosts. Every summer since then, about 24 of Mark's relatives drive out to Claire's Acres in their minivans and pickup trucks, wearing sun hats and toting coolers full of potato salad. They write me checks totaling over $9,000 for a weekend. I don't attend, of course. My camp manager handles the rentals, a cheerful woman named Iris who doesn't know the full history, but thinks it's nice that the original family still visits. I use every dollar of that rental income, every single cent of those reunion checks, to fund full scholarships for grieving children who couldn't otherwise afford a week of camp. I never smile when I think about it, but I do feel a quiet, bone-deep symmetry. I watch their names roll in on the registration list, the same last names that Mark tried to use as a shield, and I remember the day my sister's wobbly handwriting said, "Save yourself." I did. I saved myself, and I saved a lot of other children along the way, and I built something on that land that will outlast any potluck, any reunion, any attempt to claim it back. The oaks are still there. The creek still runs clear, and the key is in the soil, a brass seed that will never sprout, but will never be forgotten. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? I want to hear your story in the comments. And if you believe that integrity and quiet planning can undo even the slickest betrayal, hit like and subscribe. I'll be here with more stories like this one. Until next time, take care of your heart and always check the county records.